Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are beaming in from. Happy International Women's Day. My name is Yves Remy, and I'm the director here at the Sridhar Rampal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy, and Services. As a Caribbean, a proud Caribbean institution, we join women and men all across the world and the region to celebrate women's achievements and to call to attention the need for gender equality. Many people still want to know, why is this day still being celebrated? What started out in the 1900s by labor movements in the global north is now a worldwide celebration all throughout the world. The United Nations officially recognized International Women's Day in 1975 and began celebrating it on March 8th every year. And each year, the UN selects a theme to highlight specific issues and achievements related to women's rights and gender equality. And this year's theme is Inspire Inclusion. This theme emphasizes the importance of inspiring others to understand and value women's inclusion to forge a better, more inclusive world for women where there is a sense of belonging, relevance, and empowerment. We at the SRC do our little part to bring worldwide attention to the link between women's issues and trade. And today we have prepared for you a really special event made up of two parts. We have, first of all, to celebrate the SRC's Distinguished Woman in Trade Awards, the awardee being Dr. Lystra Fletcher-Paul. Talk about that in a little while. And behind me are some of her specially invited guests. On the panel with me in person are some of our panelists. And we have a few representatives for the SRC's MITP cohort 21, as well as other well-wishers. But before I get started on the first part of our event today, let me just briefly go through the order of show. So we will start with just a brief award ceremony to Dr. Lystra Fletcher-Paul, who I will affectionately call Lystra. And then we will turn to the SRC's book launch and panel discussion. The book launch is in commemoration or celebration of a book that I co-edited with one of our panelists, who I will shortly introduce, Professor Amrita Bahri, and another editor, Dorotea Lopez, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. After the brief book launch, we will then move into a panel discussion of about an hour, where we will talk about crafting gender responsive trade policies. And we have two of our speakers on that panel to my left. So let's start with the tearjerker. As I mentioned, the SRC does its part to celebrate amazing Caribbean women of the regional soil. Literally today, as we have an outstanding career professional in agriculture policy and research. The Outstanding SRC Award recognizes women who have contributed in one way or another to advancing trade policy in the region, whether through advocacy, policymaking, research, and any of these areas that bring forward the trade policy of the Caribbean. Former awardees included Dame Billy Miller, former Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados, longtime trade minister, and former director of the Office of Trade Negotiations, Ambassador Gail Mathern, who also served as Jamaica's ambassador to the WTO. As you will hear, today's awardee Lystra has held significant positions in organizations across the Caribbean in the area of food and agriculture, at a time when trade and food security are seen as inextricably linked for the Caribbean's development, and where our CARICOM leaders have prioritized cutting our food import bill by 25% by 2025. As you will also hear, her reach extends beyond her professional pursuits to mentorship, to friendship, and everyone we asked has extolled her amazing personality, not just her dry profession, but what she has continued to do in the area of teaching, writing, and research. So before I go and wax lyrical, we have asked a special lady on my left here, the UN Women's Representative for multi-country UN Caribbean Office, to do us the favor of collating a number of perspectives of special persons dear to her who have kindly shared with us their thoughts on Lystra's contribution. Tony will briefly give some of her accolades, and let me just say thank you to all of you who have joined us, her sister Louise, friends Cassandra, Ina Salas, brother-in-law Christian, one of our awardee celebrants, also Chelston Brathwaite, Ambassador Chelston Brathwaite, and of course, Tony, who is with us today. So over to you, Tony, to give the remarks on behalf of Lystra.
Thank you so much, Jan Yves, Dr. Remy. It was an honor to be requested to give these remarks for Lystra. When we say distinguished, what do we mean? I like to go to dictionaries every now and then. And it speaks first to famous. And I would say Lystra is a famous woman in the Caribbean. Famous not only because, as Ambassador Brathwaite shared with us, she holds a Bachelor of Science degrees with first-class honors from the University of the West Indies in agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago, but this first-class honors is in agriculture. She holds a PhD in biometrics and plant science from the University of British Columbia. Now, Lystra is young at heart, but when Lystra was pursuing a PhD in biometrics, how many other Black women from the Caribbean were doing this? Lystra is famous because, as Gillian Smith spoke to us about and shared, she is a true champion of agriculture and a true pioneer in her pursuit of the sustainable development goals. Lystra is famous because, as Ina Harvey also shared with us, Dr. Ina Harvey, she has been able to share across the Caribbean best practices in supply chain logistics and cluster development approaches, and the promotion of production of indigenous commodities to serve the region in lowering its import bill. These are some of the reasons in which Lystra is famous. But Lystra is renowned because Lystra is one of the most beautiful human beings that many of us know. I get a little emotional. Everybody's comments on Lystra spoke to her easy smile, her grace, her passion, and to quote Gillian Smith, she is the most selfless person she has ever met. Lystra is a wife and a mother too. Grown sons, successfully thriving grown sons. To be able to balance mothering, wifing, daughtering, sistering, while being celebrated for all you have been able to achieve professionally is the feat of an extraordinary human being. Lystra, you are extraordinary. You are not only a champion of agriculture, you are a champion of people. I'm so excited that we are able to come together today to honor you, to recognize your accomplishments for the Caribbean, recognize that these accomplishments are not only at the policy level. Farmers across the Caribbean have felt the impact of your work. Women farmers, men farmers, we have been able to see a shift in our understanding of really loving what is ours. We don't need to import pasta when we have incredible yam and eddos here. We also see that you are about paying it forward. To be distinguished is to also be able to ensure that your legacy lasts beyond your time. We're not talking about your time ending anytime soon. None of us are ready for that at all. We're living for another 34 years, Lystra. But the fact that you retired and continue to teach, continue to mentor women like me, women like Jan Yves, make time for us to sit down and discuss the difficult parts of balancing this work is so appreciated. Your legacy is living through all of us, through your children and through your adopted friends and family. So thank you, Lystra, for everything that you do. You are truly a distinguished woman of Trinidad and Tobago, a distinguished woman of St. Lucia, a distinguished woman of the Caribbean.
Barbados.
And Barbados.
Yes.
We are honored to know you. We are honored to celebrate you.
Before I give our awardee an opportunity to respond to these wonderful remarks, I said it was a tearjerker. That's funny. I was gonna have to hold you up. I also know I speak on behalf of all of us young women. I know Rhea Brathwaite, Chelsea's daughter, and you worked on We Will, which is another empowerment organization. And let me just say, I know that your husband, Neil, and boys are watching proudly, Kamau and Tarek. And this is just a very small token of all of the appreciation that we have for you as a woman, mother, sister, sister-in, friend, sister-in-law. And let me just offer you the opportunity to respond. I will mention all of those who prepared written and video remarks. We will share that with you. We don't want to overwhelm you too much. But over to you, Lystra, the woman of the hour.
Thank you very much, Remy. Thank you very much, Connie, for the kind words. My family and friends, my posse in the back here. Good morning, everybody, and happy International Women's Day. I'm indeed honored and humbled to receive this award. Thank you. I have to say that when I read Janine's email telling me that I was given this award, a range of emotions came over me. First of all, I was surprised, and there was a lot of disbelief. I read the letter 3 times. I could not believe that I was the honoree, honestly. And when I thought about it, I said, you know, our food import bill is still $5 billion. Our countries are still importing as much as 80% of the food they consume. Our young people, especially our women, are obese, 1 in 3. And I'm not fat shaming anybody, I'm just being very honest. And when I go to the supermarket, especially at the beginning of the school term, I look in the carts of the women or mothers, and I'm seeing chips, corn kernels, boxes of fruit, of juice, sugar, fat, oil, everything like that. So I said,
Why not?
Have I really made a difference? So the next emotion that came over me, apart from the surprise and disbelief, was I started to cry. Now you know me, I cry a lot. But there were tears, not just of sadness because of the slow pace of development of food security in the region, but also tears of joy because, first of all, my work has been acknowledged, but also I'm seeing new developments in the area of food security. We have the 25 by 25 initiative that you mentioned. I'm seeing the fact that the private sector is now on board with the CPSO. I'm also listening to the news where the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados is talking about healthy schools, where they're looking at healthy meals in schools, and they're doing a lot of advocacy about front of package labeling and things like that. So there are baby steps, but they're steps in the right direction. And then I also thought about my journey as a woman working in this field of agriculture and food security. It has not been easy. This journey is not for the faint-hearted. As a woman, I've had to, as you say, juggle multiple roles. Wife, mother, daughter, took care of my mother at some point, sister, friend, mentor, professional, sub-regional coordinator, country representative, office manager. Finding the balance is a challenge. More often than not, I've had to put myself last. And in the end, you pay for it in your health and sometimes your family. So, and since today is International Women's Day, I want to give some advice to the women among us. First of all, don't try to be a man. Be yourself. Be kind. Be honest. Be respectful. Don't be afraid to use your intuition and to bring those special qualities of being a woman, your empathy, your caring, into your style of working and managing people.
And your dress.
Don't be afraid to take risks or to speak your mind. And if you are wrong, Salas will tell you. This is something we always talk about. If you are wrong, admit it and apologize. But most importantly, put your health and your family first. Because when all of this is gone, that is who you have left. That's all you have left. I would like to believe that in finding the balance, I have not really done a good job. I have been, there's a new term that I recently heard. I've been intentionally unbalanced in that I have had to put certain things forward and give priority depending on how important it was at the time. It's not a balance that everything is at the same.
That's right.
You have to give importance depending. So it's intentionally and sometimes unintentionally unbalanced. But more importantly, I would not be here today without the grace and guidance of Almighty God, and without a community of family and friends who have been by my side. So in essence, this award is not mine, it's for all of us. I'm only here because of the prayers, love, support, and encouragement of a number of people. So, Johnny, the last emotion that I felt when I read your letter was gratitude. And David Brother has a song called Dedication where he says, not one name shall I call, because if I leave some else, it make the others feel small. But forgive me if I call a few names.
Call them.
First and foremost, my husband of 36 years. Neil. And our two sons, Kamal and Tarek, who have been my rock, my anchor, and who have kept me grounded through the good times and the bad. There have been some tough times. Unfortunately, Neil is not here, but he's in the Young Men in Toronto. And I tell people, Neil deserves the Trinity Cross and the Order of St. for putting up with me and my vaulting ambition. I want to thank my family, my deceased parents, my sister Louise, who's here, my brother Ian in Trinidad, the Springer family, the Fletcher family, and my in-laws, the Paul family of St. Lucia. They have given me a keen sense of the importance of family, education, hard work, and service to others, especially the poor and the vulnerable. To my sister friends from Bishop Anstey High School, that factory of strong women. And I have two of them here with me, Cassandra Rogers, Kathy, my, what do you call it? My deputy sister. Sorry. I also want to thank a group we call the Federation of 1978, which is my group of classmates from the Faculty of Agriculture, who will go down in history as the best proper graduates the faculty has ever produced. Across 100 years of education. Special thanks to Charleston Bradford, my lecturer, my mentor, and my friend, who gave me my first job in an international organization. I want to mention Dr. Pataline, who opened the door for me to join FAO. My staff of FAO, Guyana, Trinidad, wherever I had worked, and many dear friends and colleagues. I said I wasn't going to call, but I have to call out you. Winston Ruther, Barbara Graham, Dick Ford, Jillian, Laura, Ina, Terry, Luther, Tina, Christina, Marjorie, Salas. And forgive me for those who I have not called, but memories lapse. So I just want to say to you all, thank you, my heartfelt thanks. There's an ancient African word called Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't end by saying that we all have to be advocates of Caribbean food security as consumers, researchers, negotiators, educators, policymakers, private sector people, farmers, because we cannot and must not be dependent on others for something as fundamental as the food that we eat. To all of you, thank you.
It speaks for itself why you were chosen. You are definitely a friend of the SRC. Neil was our previous director, and we got to know you. But when the names came up, I'll tell you this: when the names came up for are we going to award this year, and you were shortlisted, it was unanimous that, for the reasons you yourself explained and Tony explained, that has become even clearer today, there is such an importance to the work that you're doing and have done and continue to do. And I think this was one of the most heartfelt speeches that I've heard on Women's Day that merges, as you say, you as a woman with your professional exploits. And in fact, the person you are comes out even more beautifully than what you have done in the past and what you will continue to do in the future. Somebody once said, it's really most important, not what people did, and they say how they make you feel. Yeah. And I'm feeling very emotional. Right? So thank you, all of you. I know sister is from overseas and visiting, and all of you who've made the effort. And I must mention by name persons who have contributed to the tributes who we reached out to. And we have amassed them in a little book, which we will share. Charleston Bradford, Ambassador John D. Ford, Mr. Patrick Aline, Mrs. Ina Harvey, Miss Gillian Smith, all of them have written on your behalf to show and demonstrate how important you are. So without further ado, we will present you, hope I can be heard, with our small token of appreciation on behalf of the management and the staff of the Street Rental Center Lystra. Are we okay for the pictures? We would love to present you with our Street Rental Center Distinguished Outstanding Women's Award in Trade for 2024. And please accept also this very small token of our appreciation for what you continue to do and what we will shamelessly promote and the Trade Policy and Gender Equality book that I co-edited with the panelists and co-wrote a chapter with Tony. So on behalf of the center, and this is just some of the tributes. We have to add one or two, and there was a video by Jillian as well. So I'm sure everybody will want to add, we will increase the book, but for now, please accept this as a tip. Very well. Thank you so much. And you're free to remain here or you can take your seat while we transition to the second part. Yes.
And then one with Johnny.
Yeah, could you put,
Yes.
as you can see, we'll take the pictures after we. I feel like a paparazzi. Daniel and Tony to join me on this side of the table.
All right, take care.
Thank you all so much.
No,
I'm good.
all right.
Thank you so much. So thank you all of you who have stayed for the first part of our presentation. Thank you everyone. And now we move to the second part of our event today in celebration of International Women's Day, which is to celebrate the book launch of Trade Policy and Gender Equality, the book that I just showed, which was published by the Cambridge University Press last year, and is actually an open source book, which means that it's free to download all chapters and all of the work online. So the book actually forms the background for our discussion among a panel of amazing women who are going to take us to different parts of the world to learn from experiences on the topic crafting gender responsive trade policies, and who I have in good fortune been able to work with in different capacities closely over the past 2 or 3 years. And I'm not going to regale you with their bios, but I am going to introduce them just by their current titles. We have Professor Amrita Bahri, who is a professor in international trade law at ETAM. We have Dr. Danielle Bob, who is a lecturer in gender and development studies right here at the Cave Hill campus, UE. We have Professor Catherine Coleman, co-director of the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development at Georgetown University. And we have Tony Broadbell, the representative of UN Women Multi-Country Office Caribbean. Both Tony and Daniel are with us in person. So you've heard enough of me. I'm gonna go swiftly to our speakers and ask, first of all, Amrita Bahri, who is one of the co-editors of the publication, to tell you a little bit about the themes covered in the book, the topics, as well as the outstanding issues for trade policy and research, crafting of trade policies across the world that come out of the book that we co-edited. So over to you, Amrita.
Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Genevieve. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see you in here, though. I wonder if we can go on to be able to see you. Don't know.
I have my camera on.
Those on Zoom can probably see you. So please go ahead.
All right. Okay. Well, happy Women's Day to everyone, to all my dear friends and colleagues and others who are with us today in this beautiful celebration. Congratulations, Dr. Paul. It's an honor to be here and be a part of this very special celebration. So big congratulations for the achievements. And yes, well, Genevieve did mention how this book has come out as completely open access, which means you can download it without any cost repercussions. The book is titled Trade Policy and Gender Equality. It's published by Cambridge University Press. And we are all very thankful to the support we received from the WTO Chess program, the donors, and the WTO Trade and Gender Office, who could allow us to have this book published as an open access. So Genevieve asked me, she gave me the responsibility of talking about the book. So So what is this book about? This book is about, well, first and most importantly, and that's the reason why we are launching it today on Women's Day, it's about women. It's about women and trade, and some part of it touches upon investment. So this book is about an attempt to answer a broad question of whether trade and investment policies, to some extent, are a suitable vehicle for advancing gender equality. And most of us, the editors and the contributors of the book, have concluded that they are. But we have also concluded that they are unreliable agents of gender equality for the time being, given how they are being framed, given how they are being included in the current trade and investment policies. So if you zoom into the chapters of this book, you will find a number of chapters touching upon a range of outstanding issues that have been raised in trade policy making and by trade policymakers from time to time. What role can WTO play in facilitating an inclusive trade environment that works for the benefit of all? Should gender responsive provisions be included in trade policy instruments at all? Do such instruments really assist in reducing the barriers that women face? How are the countries incorporating such provisions in their agreements, in their policies, and how are they implementing them in their domestic policies? In what forms, with what scope? What makes a policy or an agreement gender responsive for that sake? What are the problems? What are the challenges? When we talk about women concerns in respect of these market access instruments, so to say, and what are the different options that developing and least developed countries have to increase their capacity, their expertise on negotiating issues relating to trade and women's concerns. This book has made, in this sense, this book has made an attempt to examine economic policies, trade policies, and to some extent investment policies, how they might be adapted to more effectively address women's concerns. How can we impact, how can we influence these policies to address women's concerns? And in doing so, we have tried to offer both descriptive as well as an analytical account of whether trade and investment agreements can really enhance the concerns and help women overcome the barriers that they are facing on the ground today in different jurisdictions. And how, if at all, if we are convinced that these instruments can be used to some extent, how can we negotiate these instruments to help them benefit these concerns or strengthen these concerns? What different options do we have to mainstream gender equality concerns in these instruments? What are the regional experiences and so on and so forth? So if you really try and look at the structure of the book, it has three different wings. It has three different parts. Part one deals with WTO and women, WTO and gender equality. It really tries to sort of focus on WTO as an organization which can naturally lead this process given its expertise in global rulemaking and its institutional position. But the beauty of this section and three chapters in this section is that it tries to offer arguments from both sides of the table. So we look at why WTO is a natural organization for setting rules in this respect, but we also go on the other side of the table and see why it makes a very difficult case, why this organization makes a very difficult case to talk about women in context of international trade. Um, then the second part of this book is about the current issues, the cross-cutting issues in trade policies and gender equality, where we talk about a number of substantive sort of aspects that we see in terms of negotiation process. It offers a lot of food for thought on various cross-sectional issues. So we talk about investment, women, e-commerce, negotiating capacity, least developed countries, COVID-19 pandemic, gender responsive standards, MNEs, their interaction with the foreign investment in women, looking at investment treaties and what they have to offer, agriculture, and so on and so forth, and even voluntary sustainable standards. So as you can see, we have dedicated this particular section and the chapters we have in this section to a range of cross-cutting issues to find intersection between women trade and other areas which are quite relevant. And then we have the third part, which is regional sort of approaches. So it's all about it brings together in a range of chapters, different sort of region-specific case studies, country-specific case studies on trade and gender mainstreaming approaches, where we talk about the negotiating experience, we talk about the obstacles, the hurdles, the challenges, and the success stories of these regions in including women concerns or in applying as we call it, a gender lens in their trade policies and the negotiation of their trade policies. We look at North America, we look at South America, we look at the Caribbean, we look at Asia Pacific, Africa. So the aim in this particular final third sort of part of the book is to provide policymakers, negotiators with a range of options and experiences to build upon. And so this is how we have structured the book and different chapters of the book. And I'm aware that I'm running short of my time, so I think to conclude, let me provide you a checklist of questions, which as I raise the questions, you can answer them in your mind, and then you can decide whether you want to read the book. So question 1, whether WTO is really gender blind or gender responsive as an organization. And what are the problems it is really having on taking over a concrete commitment in respect of women in its trade agreements, in its hard documents? Number 2, what is the relationship between trade, investment, and gender? Number 3, how can we enhance women empowerment through trade in services, digital trade, standardization, resource access, regulation of food security, and agriculture? Number 4, what have been the experiences and practices and shortcomings and success stories from different regions in this respect, so we can get together and learn from each other, because this is such a nascent field, and the understanding is really not there because we don't have data, we don't have evidence yet. And finally, number 5, how can we bring developing countries and least developed countries on board this dialogue? Because so far, this dialogue has mostly been captured by the developed world. So how can we include and strengthen the participation of developing and least developed countries in respect of creating trade and investment policies with a gender lens? So if you're looking for these answers, this book is a one-stop shop for you. And thank you. Thank you, Janine, for having me here.
So much, Amrita. Pleasure doing this exercise with you. And I think you asked really great questions, some of which are answered in the book, but some of which might be answered in part 2 of the book when we do the second version, and maybe we'll get Lystra to add a chapter, right, on agriculture and the new issues on agriculture and trade. Thank you so much for that overview of the book. And yes, it's available open source. Let's move very quickly now to Tony, who is a co-author of the chapter Leave No Woman Behind, looking at some of the issues relating to trade policy and the Caribbean in particular. And to give her an understanding of where trade policy in the Caribbean needs to go, given her wonderful bird's eye view across the region of gender equality issues affecting women's empowerment, and thinking about what are the areas that trade policy needs to catch up, lead, step behind, wherever we should position ourselves as trade policy experts in the discussion of Caribbean gender issues. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you so much, Danny. It's kind of hard to move from the beginning ceremony right into this without acknowledging, and it's something that Lystra does consistently, is she centers the humanity in the work that we do and the human experience. If we're talking about trade policy, what I am noticing with our negotiators is there seems to be a very academic, esoteric approach to the negotiations that is not grounded in the reality of what people's lives are. In fact, there are so many silos at times. We have CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, happening next year. The negotiators in the permanent missions are doing the best that they can, but the experts on gender equality at the Bureau of Gender Affairs don't necessarily know what's happening with the negotiation happening there. I find as a gender specialist, I suppose, we are supposed to be assisting coordination across all key thematic areas within the UN and supporting governments to do the same. But you're recognizing that even within government, the climate change division, speaking with the agricultural division, speaking with the trade division, speaking with foreign affairs, much less speaking with gender. So the key thing that needs to be done, and it comes out in our chapter as well, is we have to break some of these silos because negotiations have to be based on reality. And if our negotiations are often not based, negotiators are not based in the Caribbean. And if they're negotiating and not necessarily understanding what the realities are across all of the policies, Barbados is working on a gender equality policy, all of these countries have them, but they don't speak to one another. So how can we ensure that that happens is one of the key things that has to be done. The only way you can have that happening is if we have effective and available data. That is also sex disaggregated. That is also shared. There's something happening now in our region where data is produced, but it is not being published. How can we ensure that the information is available to those who need to inform policy and really ensure that the trade policy looks at where women are, where men are, across different ages within our spaces? The last area of the work has to do with, I wonder, the Caribbean is such an incredible place. We have such brilliant minds, but the brilliant minds, again, don't necessarily always connect what the thinking is to the ground. Hearing a lot about digitization, and absolutely we need to move in that direction. But we can't be moving to the direction of digitization if the basics around supply chain management are not yet addressed. What are we digitizing? If you digitize a broken system, you're not going to be able to have any real success. So I think the national policies that prioritize where human beings are, because this is the basics of what we mean on gender equality. Where are human beings and how can we best support them? If those basics are not tied to the priorities that we see coming out in the SIDS outcome statements, I'm not sure how many of you are aware and have looked at it. How often does trade come up in these SIDS outcomes trade statements? I know tourism is not there at all.
Trade is there. We've been looking at it, and there's some references to trade.
And is it what we need to be prioritized? Because this is the outcome statement for the next 10 years. Is this what we need to be prioritized to meet men and women where they are? Whether it is in agriculture, whether it's in small and medium enterprises, right? So we really need to have a bit of a step back. We're all running. I know they're not necessarily always as many people as we would want doing this work, but how can we take the step back to reconcile our different priorities and policies so they align with what enablers for that sustainable development success would be, which trade is. Trade is one of the key enablers of that success. And in order for women, us to meet women where they are, we have to look at their care responsibilities. And so the work being done to support comprehensive social protection, like subsidized childcare, leaving your children somewhere you can trust. And we need to start moving from only the conversation on childcare to elder care as our parents get older. and it's expensive, how can you ensure that those two policies and priorities are creating an enabling space for small, medium enterprise owners, for agriculturalists across the board, so that they can then be better able to have time to train, strengthen their capacities, build their businesses, to export, and understand what is being imported.
Always bringing it back to the fundamentals, especially for our region. And, you know, you're right. Those of us in the trade policy space are often in that kind of esoteric, technical space. And we try really hard increasingly to work with people on the ground. And this is a really great segue to our third speaker, Catherine Coleman, who is joining us from, I think, it's Georgetown University. She travels so much. I don't know where you are now, Catherine. I think you are in Washington, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. And I can't see you because we're in this room and this is hybrid, but I'm assuming you can hear us well.
Perfectly, yes. And happy Women's Day. I'm actually in California. Just back from DC. And
Before you go any further, can I ask you to turn up your volume as high as you can so those of us in the room can hear you really well, and talk as close as possible to the mic on your computer. But I just wanted to give you that introduction because I know Catherine is doing a lot of work on bottom-up approaches, and I'm sure she's going to explain that much better than I can. But her work has taken her to Africa, Asia, and she's working very closely on not just the theoretical construct for how we think about trade policy, but also how do we get people, women who are working on the ground and policies on the ground, to feed up to the negotiating space. So really great to have you, Catherine, and over to you, and just project your voice so we can hear you well in this room. Please.
Perfect. Is this better? Can you hear me well now?
We can hear you.
I maybe could go put on headphones if you want. I think that might help.
No, no, go ahead. It's okay. We can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to really project. Well, thank you for that introduction. That was absolutely perfect, I think, to sort of set up what I'm going to talk about today, which is how we could have a more bottom-up approach. And I really, really appreciated the comments that were just made about that negotiations need to be based on reality. Yes, that is what is needed here. But I think that reality needs to inform what we can look at in the broader context of incorporating gender and other issues into trade. I feel like there is this kind of mismatch between this very high level, the treaty level, the negotiation of the provisions, and the realities day to day on the ground facing women. And that's really what my work is designed to address, is how to match those two a bit better. So let me give some thoughts on that. So first of all, I'm just honored to be here. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on this wonderful event and this beautiful award. I am so thrilled to have a chapter in the book. My chapter actually focused on Africa in particular, but it took a contextual and comparative approach to thinking about how gender might move forward under the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. When I first wrote the chapter, that gender protocol was just being discussed. And so things have advanced some since then, but I think that the way that I approached it still really rings true. So I'm going to talk about this bottom-up approach. I have, in my work now, started calling this a micro approach, integrating gender, all sorts of other development issues in trade rules. And can you hear me okay still?
Much better now.
Okay, good. And so what I try to do is like I said, focus on linking the kind of high level with the more on the ground level and looking at it comparatively, because I think there's also so much to learn. I think that that Dr. Bahri talked about this too when she was framing the book. There's so much that we can learn from different regions, from different experiences. And I also have been comparing the way gender is approached in trade agreements with how other issues are approached. And one interesting takeaway that I would say on that, and really looking at the context too, what are the needs of stakeholders? How are those integrated into provisions? A lot of my work also focuses on empirical study, really, on the ground interviews and consultations, which unfortunately I was not able to do for this chapter, but I do try to integrate into a lot of my work, and I think makes so much sense here. So I just wanted to give one kind of quick anecdote, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. I gave a talk on Monday. I was actually in the Middle East on Monday, and Jean-Yves is right about me traveling around a lot. And I gave a talk with the law school in India very early in the morning. And I was looking across these different types of development provisions, small businesses, gender, labor, environment. And one of the things that I noted was that for small businesses, we actually see more detailed contextual provisions than we see on gender. And somebody had made a comment to me once, well, that's possibly because every country has small businesses that they care to promote. Well, doesn't every country have women they want to also promote through trade? Doesn't every country have an interest in this? And so I would really like to see this catch up on International Women's Day. I want us to catch up with at least how we're thinking about other parts of trade, and start to really recognize that women have particular priorities based on the kind of work they do, the sectors in which they work, and the particular challenges that they face, many of which are legal challenges relating to land ownership, relating to access to finance, relating to all kinds of other things. I also work a lot on food security and agriculture. So I think this idea of interlinking the different areas really, really makes a lot of sense. And part of my micro approach is about this contextual framework, which I'll talk about a little bit this morning. And part of it is also about learning from domestic law, which I think we also just heard in the last presentation. There's so much innovation in domestic law, or there's so much that we can take away from domestic law to think about the future of international trade law. But we don't always connect the pieces. So that's part of what the bottom-up approach to me is connecting the dots. And again, ideally really doing, roll up your sleeves, deep work to talk to the women we are trying to make sure these provisions will represent. So by and large, what we see right now in trade agreements are more declaratory, non-binding provisions. There are a couple of ways I think that we can compare across different instruments. We can look at how common certain things are. We can look at whether specific binding and enforceable commitments are created. And in some cases, softer commitments actually might be desirable. We can look at whether provisions are subject to dispute settlement on gender. They're usually not. We can look at where they align with WTO law, although in this case, WTO law, I think probably will be shaped by what's happening on the regional side and on the domestic side. WTO law right now is not developed in this area. And then we can look at contextual factors. And in 2021, I wrote a paper about how we could map out inclusive and sustainable law and development. And what I talked about in that paper, I applied in the paper for the book, which is that maybe we need to change our approach a little bit on trade and not think so much in terms of just these kind of, and I'll mention these in a bit, these, whether we have textual provisions that focus on capacity building, which is incredibly important, or reaffirming existing commitments and agreements, also very important, whether we focus on reservations or cooperation provisions. And in some cases, we're starting to see affirmative commitments. So ways in which to address some of the challenges that women face, but could we also shift the context around how we look at these rules? Could we approach them through concepts like differentiation, the idea that vulnerable communities, that women actually need different treatment under the rules, just like we have come to accept that different countries do. Could we look at them in the context of sustainability, flexibility, and really importantly, equity and inclusion? One of the other things that I focus on is just understanding some of the regulatory process. This is more of a domestic law issue, and where the barriers are to women engaging in a process, whether it's registering a business or getting some kind of certification. But that is also something I think that we could map, as is implementation. So we know that about a third of trade agreements have provisions on gender, which is, again, a great start. But we also know that many of them are really acknowledgements or reaffirmations or cooperative provisions, sometimes with institutional requirements. Dr. Bahri has done a lot of work on this. She and I have also written together on these topics. And that sometimes, including really in some of the African trade agreements, there are affirmative provisions and minimum legal standards. But this context that I talked about is still missing. We're starting to scratch the surface. There is some great work done. Again, Dr. Bahri has done work looking at how different regions think about the role of women. But I have not yet seen us really go deeply, and that's what the paper that I contributed to the book is meant to do, into how women have a role in different sectors and what the needs might be based on those rules. So how do women engage in agriculture, services? What are the different issues? Again, I think the last presentation, talked about this so beautifully. And how can we really link what we're doing in a trade context to these particular challenges? So just to kind of wrap up, I don't know how many, do I have a couple more minutes, Genevieve, or am I getting close to the end?
You have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes, perfectly. Perfect. I can do a lot with 2 minutes. So I think applying some of these more contextual framing categories, like I said, differentiation, equity, inclusion, review of regulatory barriers that women face, I think would get us to a much, much different place. And if we could combine that with some of the tools that we have used in other disciplines. So if we could combine some of this kind of shift in our thinking with empirical work, for example, if we were to go out and speak to women, which I have done in a number of different contexts and projects, we find that what they care about is actually very different often than what trade negotiators are discussing off in Geneva or, elsewhere. So I think that really bringing an empirical aspect is critical to this bottom-up approach. I think part of this too needs to be outreach. We need to engage. We need to find ways also to talk about trade agreements and international law in a way that is not technical, that is more accessible. And then some of us, I think, can translate some of that into what a trade commitment could look like. I think we also need to present options for policymakers. I've done a lot of work with the United Nations, for example, looking across trade agreements around the world and different ways that they deal with different issues, including gender. There is a handbook that we released last year in 2023 that has a chapter on gender. What are some of the different options? How can we also assess impact? But again, I think we are just scratching the surface here. I don't think that we have yet to see gender addressed in a way that is contextual, that is really meaningful. And even though I think it's a great start where we are, but I don't think that we are yet kind of getting ourselves to that level of basing trade rules on the living, day-to-day reality. So that's what I think a bottom-up approach could do. These contextual factors, which I just touched on briefly, are really outlined in this chapter. They are aligned with different sectors in which women work, with proposals on how this could play out in an African context, but this is something that we could apply to any part of the world. So I will stop with that, look forward to the discussion, and hope that some of the ideas from today, which I think so far have just been exceptional, can really resonate more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I see that there's some questions already coming in. I don't want to take any more time before we move to Daniel, but just to say that a lot of what Catherine and Amrita have spoken about actually is part of the work we at the SRC have begun doing and would like more funding to do, and for people with heirs, with deep pockets, but we'll talk about that at the end when we wrap up the discussion. So Danielle is an author herself, a co-author of a book on marginalized persons in the Caribbean and looking at gender policy. And I know that trade may not have been originally something on her radar, but we looped her into trade about, what, 2 years ago? When Amrita, myself, Dorotea, and Renata, and a group of others, actually also, we had a gentleman, also, sorry, Jermaine, work with us on putting together a course on women and trade in the Americas. And we wanted to make sure that our own homegrown institute, the Nita Barrow Institute, right here at the university, was involved in that work. And I think we've made a trade a little bit aficionada out of you. But Danielle is going to give her perspectives on this, I imagine, thoughts about the work that is happening in gender, and look to see how we can actually move forward on some of these topics, combining trade with gender policies. And then after Danielle, we will move to the questions from the audience. So please, go ahead, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Remy. Before I begin, I would like to congratulate Dr. Fletcher-Paul. I've heard about you, but just met her this morning, and I feel as if I've known her from before. We're so close. She was, she really demonstrated the theme for this morning. I felt included. All her family and friends are there, and as they came into the room where we were waiting, she introduced me to all of them, and I thought, oh, I'm so special. And so I want to thank you for that. I really felt the warmth this morning and understood what Tony was speaking about in her remarks. I do want to start from the premise that we know the importance of research, but specifically when we think about gender and trade research, we also understand that it is important for several reasons. We want to, address issues around inequality, but we want to also support economic empowerment. We want to ensure we have this business and also global competitiveness. And now for us in the Caribbean, we're talking about our sustainable development goals, which makes it even more pertinent to what we are doing. So when we think about the ways we can bring in research in this, or the collaboration between gender and trade research, we have to think about the policies. I like to go back to the starting point of when we are developing these policies, what that process looks like. And I want to take or start from the perspective of the previous speaker who spoke about the bottom-up approach. Many times we do not understand the experiences for the people, the experiences of the people for whom we are planning or we are making these plans. We are being prescriptive in our approach, and it is important for us to understand the lived experiences of all our people, but especially our women, who are often not seen as producers or traders, or even we don't think about them as consumers in this process sometimes. And so one of the key things I believe is important is for us to start integrating this gender component and analysis within our trade policies and agreements. We have to understand the differential impacts on women and men and other groups of people as well. And we've made some progress in that in a few of the policies, the Beijing platform for change and action. We saw that coming out there, but still the research is almost on paper, but it's not being transformed into practice. We have to work together to ensure that our women, especially, are involved in the trade-related decision-making processes and negotiations and policy-making. We need to know where they are located, because where they are located becomes pertinent to the discussion. What are their needs? As a group, we're all different. all of us are different as women, and so there are different needs, there are different requirements there. And Janice, you spoke about the collaboration in terms of the research that we're doing. I think we need more of that kind of collaboration where we are seeing interconnections between, the gender component, trade component, the economic component, and we're working to collect not just sex disaggregated data, which is very limited for us, especially in the Caribbean, but qualitative data that is able to capture the experiences of our women in their different capacities as mothers, as wives, as career women, as students, as people wanting to be involved, to become entrepreneurs, and understand the reason why some of our women actually are entrepreneurs. Some of them may be a passion, for others they have no choice, it was the way for them to survive. So how do they then take hold of some of the opportunities that we are recommending if we don't understand it? If you're just thinking, well, I need to provide food for my family and that's about it, nothing more. Trade and gender becomes a key component of our development process. At the Institute for Gender Development Studies, we make that link in a very direct manner to our outreach and our research and our teaching that we do. And I believe that partnering with SRC, partnering with organizations like UN Women Multi-Country Office organizations, and different international agencies that provide the funding for the kind of work we are doing will allow us to also ensure that we have the capacity and the resources to make some targeted decisions, but also demonstrates the kind of work we want to do. So get the information that we need, the kind of research that we need to actually inform policies. So that data, the questions that we're asking are questions that really capture what the people want, where they are in terms of their thinking. And it allows us then to be able to create or develop these policies that reflect the needs of our people that can then translate into our economies. We need to think about research that will support the kind of gender responsive trade policies that we have been advocating for a long time. I don't think this work is new. I think what is very new is the fact that trade policies and trade specialists are now recognizing that we need this gender component. The SDGs have now, when we look at the SDGs, gender equality stands on its own, but it runs straight through all of them, because our people are different and they have different experiences. So if we, for instance, look at our own cultural experience in the Caribbean, our own, I know this morning we talk about unpaid care work, and it's actually my area that I love. My research is around mothering and work and how women navigate that space. But if we think about where our women are located, even in going through the book, and what I love about the book too is that there are some statistics and resources there that are very, very important. But what we recognize is that you have over 80% of our women in Caribbean small island developing states are in the service industry. But where they are located are really in those low growth sectors. So where there are no opportunities for them to advance, where they are working for someone. So they're in retail, they're in hotels. And as we saw in the pandemic, when we have our tourism industry attacked, it's mostly our women who are facing the burden of care, but also financial support and other aspects. So trade becomes important there in understanding what do you need. How are you purchasing? What are the resources you need? What are the products you need to purchase? Are we producing those products here? I heard Dr. Fletcher-Paul spoke about the supermarkets and what people are buying. And sometimes we think we don't, people just, they're not listening to us, they should be eating healthy. But if we compare the cost of what is healthy versus the cost of what is unhealthy, the process, sometimes it's a lot cheaper when people have a budget, a very limited budget to work on. And while we are talking, we also need to put the resources and the money behind it, behind producing things that people can actually access, that are affordable, that are available, and that they understand the importance, the long-term importance of it. So you may not be investing, or you cannot afford to invest now in it, but later on when it begins to affect your health, then that's another cost that comes to it. You need to be able to understand those intersections and come up with, solutions around that. But I've been talking a lot, and I just want to see or conclude by saying that we do need to understand what women's economic empowerment looks like to them. What are their needs? How do they see themselves participating in trade, in entrepreneurship? Where do they see themselves located and why? And we need to ask them specifically, what are their what do they want as support? What are their goals? If we understand how gender is looking at the relations of power that exists, when we understand that it is a system where we are interacting with people based on how we are seen or perceived as a particular group, and our location, whether it's class, race, educational background, nationality, then we begin to think about how these interlinkages and intersections require a form of analysis to create policies that are more impactful, that gain or get the kind of effect that we seek. The project that we worked on, it was in 2021, creating that course, and it's opened my eyes to the intersections there. Amrita, again, another author in your book, really brought her experience as a trade negotiator, lawyer in the field. And then when I sat at the table, I brought the perspective of the gender analysis to it. We saw the ways that there were shifts, there were overlaps, there were shifts, and there were things that were needed differently. So we can sit in our silos, as Tony was saying, but when we begin to come together, that is where the power comes. And just to wrap up by saying, in 2021, Tony, I think you also sat on the 15th UNCTAD conference here, and we had the inaugural Gender Development Forum here, which demonstrated again the importance of gender and trade research and working together to kind of address the problems we have, not only in terms of achieving the sustainable development goals, but improving and enhancing the lives of all people within our Caribbean societies. Thank you.
Much, Daniel, for once again bringing it back home at the research opportunities and really anchoring it in the realities of where we are, the Caribbean policy. So we have 10 minutes left, and I really want to dedicate that to questions from the audience that are already coming in, and I will summarize them. But it would be really, I think we would not be bringing the conversation forward if I didn't for 1 minute just say what the work at the SRC is in taking some of these things forward. So we have compiled a request for funding, and it's sitting in one of the regional organizations. But we are open to sharing that request with any organization that would be interested in this work. There's already some work being done in the Caribbean on identifying where women sit on the ground at different intersections or the spectrum of trade. So as consumers, as producers, as entrepreneurs, also as caregivers, because that's a traded service sometimes as well. So the first kind of plank of the work is to go into the existing data we've collected. I know IDB has done some work. I can't not mention Jonathan Lashley, who's done amazing work on this, on the ground as women entrepreneurs, but also to expand it to consumers, caretakers, caregivers, as well as all parts of the spectrum where women sit. And from that basis, compile a sort of a document that gives policymakers a better view of where the data lags are and where the data gaps are, so that we get more information. And then taking that into a broader discussion, as we heard from Catherine and Amrita, there's certain approaches that different regions take to formulating trade policy. So Africa has a distinct approach. Latin America has Chile all the way to Mexico. but also the United States, we're part of, and Canada have different approaches as well as is Europe. So where is the Caribbean situated in terms of our trade policy across that spectrum? And how do we learn from other regions that have done it successfully or done it not so successfully so that we can actually put that forward? And then the final plank will be training. Because what you're saying is we did a course with students across the Americas, but what we realized is that the people who need to know are the gatekeepers, the people who are not sending, not allowing people to get loans at banks, right? The people who are negotiating on our behalf. The groups, and I have to big up Caribbean Women in Trade that I'm a member of, and I know our ladies are looking at us. But these organizations that are advocating on our behalf, they also need to understand the linkages between trade, data, and the positions we can take. And then the final thing is to look at the intersections. So it's not just, as you were saying, Tony, it's not just gender and trade. It's gender now, climate change, inclusive trade, sustainability, agriculture, health. How do we understand the intersectionalities between trade, gender, and all these other things so we can come up with a holistic approach that advances the society? And women are one group, but how do they also link with other groups, right? Gendered groups as well. So these are some of the things that we are trying really hard to move the discussion forward at the level of research and at the level of advocacy and negotiations. So with that short sort of a debrief of what we are doing, let me just ask the two questions and then I will see if there are any persons in the room who want to ask any questions or give any feedback. And some of the questions we have are data, particularly gender aggregated data being collected. If so, is it a priority to ensure that this is being published, shared with policymakers? And what is really preventing that from happening? I don't know if there's anyone on this table in the Caribbean who can speak to that, or any of our speakers from Amrita or Catherine who can also speak about that. So the first one is, why are we in the Caribbean so woefully behind in terms of the data? Is it true? The second question online is, and maybe Amrita, you can take this, does the book make the case that a gendered approach to trade is actually an inclusive approach that incorporates other sectors of a country's economy that have been excluded or sidelined by current policies? And do you think that this perspective helps to build support for integrating a gendered approach and could also perhaps help to provide more of the bottom-up approach that Catherine discussed? So what I'll do is maybe I'll ask the two ladies briefly in the room to talk about the data and any of the issues they want to take up, and then I'll ask Amrita as well as Catherine to give their perspectives on the other question, and then we will wrap up it, unless there is one or two questions here. So just if I can briefly ask you all to address any of the issues you raised. Okay, first of all, Tony.
All right, so the issue of data, we are when was it? Not Monday, Tuesday. There was a meeting of the UN with the different countries across the Caribbean on the multi-country sustainable development framework, which is the framework that prioritizes sustainable development goals based on Caribbean government and societal priorities. We had the representative from the CARICOM Regional Statistics Program in the room, and his call was to ensure that we have independent statistical offices across our CARICOM member states, and that those independent statistical offices also have to be perceived to be independent. And that is what will help us with sex disaggregated data. The gender analysis will allow us to make it then more gender responsive and gender responsive data. But you need an independent, really free, well-resourced statistical office to be able to get the data that we need. And I think the Caribbean is behind because, as far as we can clearly see, Jamaica has statin, but many other countries do not have as well-resourced separate data, central statistical offices. You have data being collected in the Ministry of Agriculture, data being collected in the Ministry of Health, but it's not speaking to each other and it's not being collectively analyzed. The other issue is, if you don't have that, Lystra spoke earlier, and I almost felt so sad that we have an obesity problem. We shouldn't have to say we're not fat shaming. We have an obesity problem in the Caribbean that is linked to the NCD's problem in the Caribbean. If the health policy and the health outcomes is not then speaking to the agricultural policy, and not then speaking to the trade policy, what are we doing? We
So
have
what's the
siloed
mechanism to
approaches.
do that? Because you work in that, so what do we do?
No, but UN is not the government. The UN
It's
is
a
a
government.
facilitator to support government. What I think Jamaica is doing very well is they have a planning institute, a PIOJ,
Okay.
that is supposed, I'm not saying anything is perfect, I'm saying at least from our vantage point, the governance structure is such that there is a government body coordinating across the different ministries. And if we can learn better examples from each other, that model, and an independent statistical office, then we will start the process. And I know some of our countries are much smaller, but if we stop exporting people as much as we are by creating opportunities within our government institution for our very well-educated young people to stay, then I think we will be able to have a much more rich resource base.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very solid recommendation. Over to you.
I can just add here, when it comes to gender data generally, for us at the Institute for Gender Development Studies, the research is mostly qualitative, because when we do gender research, we want to see the intersections, we want to capture the experiences of people's lives. So as it relates to health, how the economy is affecting them, climate change, all of that comes into that gender aspect. And so you'll find that data published mostly in academic spaces, journals, books, and so on, which may not be as accessible for some people. But we also do, with the support of development agencies, UN Women has been a partner, conduct research in countries and provide the data for those agencies. So it will be published through them when it comes through their analysis. We are limited there, but I am talking generally now in the Caribbean, limited in terms of our resources and our collaboration. Even nationally, different ministries don't connect in terms of their communication or even their knowledge management strategies. So that when somebody retires or leaves, that information goes as well. We have a way that we hold on to it. We're holding this as if it is ours, and so we're not sharing it. And I think we need to be able to address that as well and recognize the importance of that data. But we do have a lot of work to do when it comes to collecting that disaggregated data, the statistics specifically. But I want us to move beyond the statistics, because I also want us to see, well, we are seeing these numbers, but why? Why is this happening?
Thank you. I know we only have 1 minute to share between Catherine and Amrita. So Amrita, can you answer any of the questions and do the wrap up one time, and then Catherine?
Sure, I'll try and be really quick. So data, we're looking at a number of problems here. We're talking about data which we need to disaggregate, not only gender-wise, but industry-wise and economy-wise and whatnot. And that becomes a problem. That becomes a problem mainly when we're talking about data collection, not just in developed countries, but developing countries, least developed countries, because we really don't have the capacity to do that in the developing world. Of course, is this being done? Well, the answer is yes, but mostly the developed countries are funding some initiatives by international organizations to gather this data. So the real question remains, would we be able to mobilize this data collection and evidence collection in the developing world, and how, right? And that is still an outstanding question. Question number two, how do we bring, and does the book present a case for taking women concerns to substantive areas like sectors, agriculture, services? And definitely, I mean, we are talking about all these concerns in the book, most of these concerns, if not all, in the book, and we are explicitly putting it out there. that the current inclusions and the current developments in the field of trade and gender or investment in gender are all about promises, affirmations, cooperation activities, mention in the preamble, inclusive trade and whatnot. I think it's really time for us to start talking about and bringing on board women-related commitments in actual substantive market access trade-related areas. And just give me 30 seconds, rather 15 seconds to also mention the most recent, because I think this discussion would be incomplete if you don't mention what just happened at the ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi. So 2 days ago, they published on their website the declaration, the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Declaration from MC
Amrita, just
13.
to say that we're talking about the World Trade Organization's ministerial, where they meet together every 2 years to discuss areas to go forward in trade. Sorry, just to give a little 101 on trade.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead,
thank you, thank you, Shanice. And 2 days ago, they published the ministerial declaration on their website, and I was really sort of excited, or rather curious, to see if they have mentioned women at all, and was very happy to see the mention. It's mentioned 3 times, 4 times in the whole declaration. It's para 16. But this is how it reads. We recognize that women's economic empowerment and women's participation in trade contributes to economic development. I'm just reading the relevant sections. We take note of the WTO work and the work of other relevant organizations regarding this area. And that's it. It ends there, full stop. No commitments, no promises, no affirmations whatsoever. After everything and all the work and discussion that we have built in the last few years and decades, but not to mention, it accompanies a beautiful footnote. And the footnote reads, it's footnote 2. These are general messages on cross-cutting issues. General messages on cross-cutting issues that do not change the rights or obligations of WTO members and do not relate to any joint statement initiative. Punto. So there you go. This is where we are right now.
Still a lot of work to do, and so happy to have you, Catherine, and the ladies here pushing that work, Amrita. Thank you so much for that. A little bit of a solemn way to end your perspectives, but you know, it's a lot of work to do, but thank you so much. And then the last word is with you, Catherine, and I do have to see if there's anyone in the room, not least of all our awardee, who may want to say anything. But over to you, Catherine, and then we will move quickly to close.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that Amrita mentioned this. I think this is part of the reason, as I said earlier, that I think that the action is going to come more at the regional level. And hopefully that will push upward. That's part of the bottom up, I think, approach that we talked about. Do this on a smaller scale and then push up to change international rules, which really do need to catch up. I just want to quickly comment on the question about whether these approaches are inclusive. And I really like, actually, Andrea, how you framed that. It was good to see your name come up. I think that you know, when we think about inclusive trade, we often think about putting gender into a trade provision or putting gender into an agreement. And we don't often think about really exploring the intersections. And I think we need to change that, because as Amrita said, and this has really been where a lot of my work has focused, I'm a former trade negotiator as well. So I tend to think about what's going to really have an impact and what would you put into an agreement. We have to go into the substance. We have to go into the sectors. We have to go into the challenges. We have got to find a way to make sure that these provisions on gender are not just kind of window dressing, as I think we have said in other papers. The methodology that I talked about, that I have in the paper in the book, and links to another paper, the 7 factors, I think helps a little bit with that, because it helps us to start thinking, you know, to start to think about the way that we're designing provisions on gender so that they actually achieve other goals, that they tie into the SDGs, that they tie into some of these broader principles. But I think that we need to go very deep with this. And this is, I was thrilled to hear, Jean-Yves, how you're thinking about the work of the SRC going forward. Wholeheartedly, you know, support everything that you've laid out. And I think that, just to close, to say that that I'm working on another paper, as we all usually do, that gets more into some of these empirical approaches, because I think that we can take some of that type of work, qualitative and quantitative, and put it into this context of really trying to identify, again, talking to women and listening to their views and listening to their needs first and foremost, and pulling that back into this conversation on what trade agreements should look like. So this was a great conversation, and I just thank you so much for having me as part of it.
Excellent. Well, it was our pleasure to have all of these experts with us from around the world and in person. And I know it's those of you who are online and those of you who are stuck here and cannot leave. I just wanted to see if there's anyone in the room who wanted to make any comments or say anything before we close off. No pressure, please.
Just one comment in my previous life as a biometrician, the whole issue of data and data collection and sustainability of data collection comes with people understanding the utility of the data. They have to understand how the information that we get from that data is going to work for me, because in that way it would be sustainable. There's another aspect of data now, the big data analytics.
Yes.
And there are people who are harvesting our data and using it for their advantage, and we are out of the picture.
Right.
So this whole issue of data ownership is important.
We didn't even get to the AI.
Exactly.
And so again, thank you, Lystra, for
Yes.
bringing it to that level.
Yes.
Where we can learn from your experience, but also think about, you're right, the utility. What do we need it for?
Yeah, and it comes to the channels of communication. From working in the UN, what I have found is there's too much of UN speak, and we talking to one another. But the people for whom this information is really needed, they are not getting it.
That's right.
You are publishing in your research journals, but you're not going down to the information that the people who really need it can benefit from it. So I think the channels of communication are very important as well.
Excellent. Nothing less expected. I have students in the back there, and I'm always asked, what do the students think? So we have MITP Masters in Trade Policy cohort 21 here, and want to give them any opportunity. No pressure, we can talk afterwards, but if any of you wanted to ask a question, no? Okay, we'll talk afterwards. We know we have some wonderful eateries for those of who are assembled here. Let me just first of all say how much of a pleasure it has been every year, but in particular this year, to do this Women's Day, International Women's Award, by the wonderful panelists here and online, by our spectacular awardee. Persons who are assembled here in person and who have contributed to the little tribute, and I don't think I mentioned Professor Wayne Gadpat, who also worked with you. So he as well participated in the little tribute that we have given to Lystra. And let me thank my SRC staff, the people who made this all happen, Alicia Nichols, to Neil, who's been doing a lot of the runaround as well, Desiree Adila, who does all of our work for our graphics, etc., and is always in communication, and all of the staff, Andre, Clauzel, Kian, all of those who make it possible for us to come out every week, every month, to present these events to you. I want to thank Jamal Innes and Sally Dean for their online assistance. And I just want to thank everyone and remind you all to inspire inclusion. That's our theme for Women's Day. Let's all think about how do we inspire inclusive approaches towards women, women's policies, women and gender equality. And thank you all for making this a wonderful event. And I wish you all a wonderful day and weekend. So thank you all.